Hi there, I'm James Ryerson, and this is Line Edit, a video series about popular scholarly writing, generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Who am I? I'm a newspaper and magazine editor. I've been in the industry for more than 2 decades now, at a variety of publications, but for the past 18 years I've been at the New York Times, first at the Sunday Magazine, and now at the Opinion Pages. On each episode of Line Edit, I'll talk about my experience editing a specific piece by an academic that I've worked with. These are short pieces written for wide audiences about the big questions. So today we're going to talk about an op-ed that ran in the New York Times called "Is Quantum Entanglement Real?" It was written by the physicist and historian of science David Kaiser at MIT, and it was published November 14th, 2014. So the story behind this piece is a sort of curious one. I received an email from Dave. I think it may have been the first time we worked together. Maybe it was the second. We hadn't worked together a lot, but he sent me a note in October of 2014 saying that he had a suspicion, just based on a hunch, that the Nobel Prize the following month would be awarded to a handful of scientists who had done kind of pioneering empirical work to try to establish that a phenomenon called quantum entanglement in quantum mechanics was in fact real and not just a theoretical construct that allows the theory to work nicely on the blackboard, but an actual feature of the real world. If you're interested in the full saga of how this piece came about and Dave's fascinating work and how the piece ultimately ended up on the page, you can check out our Line Edit podcast in which I talked to Dave about the whole gory story. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 3 edits. A big picture edit has to do with the overall kind of framing of the piece, a mid-size edit, which has to do with really focusing on a key issue having to do with the core substance of the piece, and then a smaller edit, a relatively limited intervention that has an outsized impact. So the first edit I want to talk about today, the big picture edit, has to do with this notion of the piece's peg. As I just mentioned, Dave had proposed that in the absence of these physicists winning the Nobel Prize, he would peg the piece, or tie it, to the 50th anniversary publication of this physics paper. Now, ordinarily, that's not the kind of peg that I'm particularly interested in when I'm editing a general interest piece like this. We journalists often call these false pegs. Anniversary pegs are considered false pegs. Anytime you have something to say and it doesn't naturally align with the news or the zeitgeist or anything that feels topical, but you're just forcing it. You're looking for something in the news that will give you an occasion to send it to an editor and try to convince them, as it were, that your piece is suddenly topical. For instance, this John Bell paper and its 50th anniversary. Typically, if a physicist had sent me a piece like this pegged to the 50th anniversary of this paper, I would have said, unless people are parading down Fifth Avenue celebrating the 50th anniversary, unless there are fireworks displays and extensive debates on television news about the legacy of this paper, then it's a false peg. So for me, even in the absence of a Nobel Prize, what Dave had to say had sort of 2 merits, and neither of which had anything to do with the 50th anniversary of this paper. One was that Dave was proposing to explain very clearly what quantum entanglement is. And this sort of service that a journalistic piece can provide, it comes up from time to time. There's a need for what we often call explainer pieces. So if something is coming up in the news, let's say GameStop's stock is being inflated in an astronomical way, there's often a need for an explainer piece that says, what is shorting a stock? What is a short squeeze? These kinds of basic explainers. And in science, it comes up fairly often that people don't really remember what quantum entanglement is, what the theory of relativity is. And there's a real service to providing something like that when there's an occasion. Now, as I said before, there was no Nobel Prize, so there wasn't really an occasion of that sort. But Dave's piece makes clear that he himself is doing work that is advancing the story of quantum entanglement and that attempts to determine whether or not it's a real feature of the world. So that itself was enough for me. The fact that the piece provided the general service of reminding interested lay readers in what quantum entanglement is, and then the fact that, as you discover later in the piece, he himself is in the middle of doing work, ongoing work designed to advance this conversation. So, with those two features in place, I was happy to give him his sort of false peg because it read nicely. But the main reason we're doing this piece is not because of an anniversary. The main reason we're doing it is because the phenomenon of quantum entanglement is super interesting and because Dave has something new to say. If there's a true occasion to write your piece, if someone wins the Nobel Prize and you want to write about their science, that's great. You should definitely use that peg. But if you have something to say and you find yourself hunting through the news looking for something that you could maybe tie it to, you're approaching it the wrong way. For the second editorial point, I want to focus on something more mid sized. About halfway through Dave's piece, he's talking about attempts to empirically test whether quantum entanglement is real. And he winds up giving us three examples. Each one probably takes about a paragraph to work through. Three examples of physicists who, in different ways, had tested different aspects of this problem of quantum entanglement. In the original draft, as I said, he works through each example in kind of its own paragraph, and each one is given equal weight. Perhaps and probably because Dave thought they were all equally important. But in the edited version of the piece, you'll see that we left the first example more or less entirely intact, and then compressed the other two examples, each to about a sentence. So the general effect is to say, here's one example, I'm going to walk you through it. And then we say, other successful experiments followed. One was like this, and the other was like that. Very brief, just three sentences to get through the fact that there were other experiments and that there were two other experiments. So, three sentences just to convey all that information. And the reason I made that edit was that the pieces, even explaining one of them in the context of a small, compressed kind of explanation like this, it's a lot to ask a reader to work through it. And the explanations are complicated. And by the time you've read one, you read another one, it sounds very similar. Some of the details are slightly different, some of the details are the same. It becomes very hard to tell what you're supposed to be paying attention to amid all this detail. But what you're supposed to be paying attention to is one example that gives you a sense of what these experiments look like, and then the fact that there were two others. That's really all you need to do in a piece like this. And I think the general lesson here, especially for academics doing this kind of writing, is that there is something like a law of diminishing marginal return for examples. In general, if you want to make one point, you should illustrate it with one example. In an academic context, I can see why this might not feel natural. You make an assertion, and it's much better if you can cite 10 papers than if you can cite one paper, or if you can cite 10 experiments rather than one experiment. Because in an academic context, you're really marshaling evidence. You're really trying to make the case that your assertion is backed up and perhaps true. But in a journalistic context, you're trying to do something different with that example. You're not trying to marshal a lot of evidence to convince the reader that you're, in fact, telling the true and full story. All you're trying to do is make a claim and give the reader some sense of what exactly it is you're talking about, what these experiments looked like. And then after that, all you need to do is suggest there were a couple others. Maybe they varied in a certain detail. Maybe they were done in a different country, or maybe they were done focusing on a different aspect of the problem. It's okay to shade it a little, but again, the general point for the reader is there's a couple other examples here. So don't forget, sometimes fewer examples, usually just one, is better than many. So the third edit I want to talk about is a relatively small editorial intervention. And it takes place late in the piece when Dave is explaining one of the really fascinating aspects of his work. In order to explain the edit, let me first explain what's fascinating here. So Dave and his colleagues are trying to test to find out if whether quantum entanglement is real. And there turns out to be a very kind of mind-bending problem that they run into, which is it turns out that in order to do these tests, the experimenter, the scientist, has to make a sort of arbitrary decision about what settings to place the apparatus on, exactly how to what to measure and exactly how they're gonna measure it. And the strange twist is that it turns out that the experiment really relies on the fact that the scientist is really truly free to make this arbitrary decision about how to set the machine here, how to set the experimental apparatus. But if there's some causal force in the kind of chain of historical causal forces that lead up to the physicist making this decision that somehow determines what the scientist is doing here, so that it's not a fully free decision, but rather somehow causally determined, then the experiment doesn't really work. And Dave and his colleagues were in this odd position where it looked as though, in order to justify their experiment, they were going to have to prove that humans have free will. In order to conduct this empirical investigation, they're going to have to somehow solve this age-old philosophical problem. Now, what's ingenious about what Dave and his colleagues did is that they realized that though they couldn't do that, there was a kind of clever way they could design the experiment that would basically rule out the need to solve that philosophical problem as much as possible. So that's the sort of unusual and fascinating aspect of Dave's work. Now, when he explains this in the piece, he does really a marvelous job of explaining this. As you could tell from my own attempt to explain it, it's a very complicated concept. He does a wonderful job. However, there's one little part of his exposition that I thought could be improved upon. When he first starts to explain this whole complicated concept, he just says that this problem, this loophole that they're dealing with, is sometimes dubbed the free will loophole. And that's how he introduces it. Sometimes dubbed the free will loophole, he introduces the phrase right at the beginning of the explanation. What I ended up proposing to Dave is that he drop it from the outset, that he not introduce this whole idea by mentioning free will, but rather that he explain the nature of the problem, and that once it was all clearly explained, that we would just add a quick 3-sentence sequence that says, how are we going to close this loophole? Well, obviously, we're not going to try to prove that humans have free will, but we can try something else. So why did I propose that edit? My hunch was that a phrase like free will loophole is so, as it were, compressed and complicated that to put it at the outset is really to open up more questions than you're answering. When you're about to explain something very complicated, it's generally not a good idea to explain it by reference to another concept that is not transparent or clear on first read by way of introduction. So it's very hard to say, I'm about to explain this complicated thing, and you might know it as the free will loophole. That's just adding complexity in front of complexity. So what I suggest is that he tried to minimize the complexity, drop that phrase, and just explain the science as clearly as he could. And then once it's all done, he can draw out the fact that what we've just seen is this kind of amazing situation where he's being asked to try to prove that humans have free will, but he's realizing that we can actually going to have to try to do something to solve this problem. So I think the key point here generalizes, and I think it's something that academics run into a lot. It's not useful to give the reader a little handle, a little kind of shorthand for an idea before you've introduced the idea. You wind up giving the reader a handle for an object that they don't know what they're supposed to put the handle on. And in an academic context, academics get very used to this. They work often in shorthands. They're dealing with lots of complicated ideas, so they have little phrases or handles for them. And so they're used to introducing them by handle. But in these types of cases, it makes more sense to describe what it is you want to describe, explain what it is you want to explain. And if it's then useful to give it a name, to give it a tag, to provide a handle for someone to be able to hold it more easily, provide it then. But don't do it before you've done the work of actually explaining what it is that the handle is going to attach to. Thanks again for joining us for Line Edit. We're very grateful to the public engagement team at the John Templeton Foundation who made this project, as well as its associated podcasts, possible. Thanks too to Professor Dave DeSteno and Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University, which administers our grant. And of course, we couldn't have done this without the generosity of David Kaiser, who graciously allowed us to look under the microscope at his first draft, as well as the final product. This video was hosted and produced by me, James Ryerson, and produced and edited by Joseph Friedman. Happy writing.